in this episode.
Say that you think there's a problem that, some people are very rich and some people are very poor. This is not good for overall well-being,
Like the
right?
world we live
It
in.
will be right, exactly. So it would be as we talked about before, like $20 means much more to a poor person than a rich person. So it seems like there's a utilitarian case for redistribution there, right? The sort of individualistic utilitarian is going to say, okay, so that means you have a duty to donate your $20 to give direct. But what they're not able to say is, hang on, why don't we change the system so that we don't have very rich people and very poor people, but instead we have an economy that tends to produce more equality, right? And why can't they say that? Well, it's because that's not the kind of thing that it's in one individual's gift to do, right? You want to change our social and economic system, that's going to have to be done by a huge organized collective of people, right? The whole society acting together, or at least a large part of it, right? A social movement or a class, right? Um, Now, if we start thinking in terms of those sorts of agents, right? So not just like, what can I do to maximize well-being in the world, but what can we do together, right? As a society or as a political party, as a movement, as a class, what can we do together to improve the world? Then these more systemic, more ambitious changes seem much more tracked, right? And so what I'm arguing in my dissertation is that both of these problems can be solved by thinking about basically the collective and social nature of individuals.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the political philosopher and researcher on utilitarianism and socialism, Dr. Nikhil Venkatesh. I came across Nikhil probably the beginning of this year when I saw a post that he's done on the Effective Altruist forum where he's asking the question, why not socialism? And this immediately drew me towards his post and then more of his work. And I found that he, in fact, has done his PhD thesis on trying to understand the social nature of a person and as to how that relates to utilitarianism. Because, of course, we all know both from the left and the right, one big critique that utilitarianism has, or rather a position against utilitarian theory, is that it doesn't account for what you would call human nature, quote unquote human nature. And of course, we did delve into that topic and we did try to demarcate between what Nikhil calls the social nature of a person as opposed to this more essentialist view of human nature, which again is a bit murky territory because really, what is human nature? It's a question that I don't think any philosopher, scientist, any thinker who's thought about it seriously can really articulate in any coherent, cogent manner. But something like the social nature, I think that we can speak of, as Nikhil argued for in his thesis. Now, of course, I didn't read his whole PhD thesis, but in his dissertation, he did outline how by viewing ourselves as a part of society, as a part of a social whole, we can in fact give a bit more credence to utilitarianism. And to be fair, it's utilitarian philosophy, even though it's one of those easily attacked, it's a big target for both sides of the political spectrum. In many ways, we all are almost unconscious utilitarian thinkers. We all do think of utility, and we try to think of things in kind of what creates the greatest good manner, overall well-being manner. And I did want to touch a bit more on kind of the view that I come from, which is more of the politics of the death drive, inspired by Todd McGovern for sure, and then he is working off Freud and psychoanalysis. But we didn't really go too deeply into that. We just kind of discussed this idea that, well, it seems that just at a very immediate level, when you experience life and you experience other people than yourself, human beings aren't always the most rational, let's call that well-intentioned beings in the world. As a species, we have a very peculiar nature to us where we tend to be a bit self-destructive and clearly do things that go against our self-interest. And then we kind of juxtapose that with Nikhil, if I may, Nikhil's idea of the social nature of a person and how, that is different to what you would call these other tendencies in a human being. And then, of course, the latter part of the conversation was pertaining to his post on the EA forum, where he tries to bring together socialism and effective altruism and tries to show that, indeed, if effective altruists really want to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, one way to do that is probably through Marxian theory and more socialist collective modes of thinking. Because as we again discuss in the podcast, individual action mostly fails, and society changes really through collective action, as we've seen historically. I should mention this, a bit of a housekeeping note, let's say. Unfortunately, despite doing over 50 episodes on this podcast so far, and majority of them being online via Zoom, this particular episode, when we had this particular conversation, I should say, there were a lot of really bad connection issues. And in the middle of the conversation, I felt bad. I had to keep asking Nikhil to repeat himself because the connection just kept dropping off. However, I did clean it up and edit it out to make it a bit more palatable. I don't think any of what Nikhil said was lost, because anytime the connection broke off, I did ask him to repeat himself. However, it's not the most smooth, seamless listening experience, in my opinion. But still, I think it's still a worthwhile conversation to listen to, especially if you're an effective altruist. You might want to consider some of what Nikhil says about Marxian theory and socialist political philosophy, and also the other way around. If you are a socialist, then probably try and account for some of the more utilitarian ethics that Nikhil argues for in his work. Without further ado, we should probably get to a bit of a formal introduction. Dr. Nikhil Venkatesh is a fellow in the Yeoh Tiong Lay Centre for Politics, Philosophy and Law at King's College London. Dr. Venkatesh specialises in moral, social and political philosophy. His research focuses primarily on utilitarianism and socialism. His PhD thesis argues that recognizing the social nature of persons makes utilitarianism more defensible. He's also interested in effective altruism, population ethics, Marxism, the ethics of data, and the nature of normativity. With that being said, here's my conversation with Dr. Nikhil Venkatesh.
Excellent. All right, Nikhil, if I could start off with probably a bit of a personal question, if you don't mind. Maybe I'm wrong to assume this, but I've got this intuition that utilitarianism as a philosophy, as a theory, it tends to be people tend to be critical of it. Philosophers tend to reject it, or perhaps you'd call it underappreciated. However, you did your PhD dissertation on utilitarianism and and human nature. So, firstly, why do you think the theory utilitarianism is that people are a bit critical of it? But at the same, when I mean people, I mean more philosophers and people who think about these things. But then, secondly, how did you get interested in studying utilitarianism?
Yeah, great. So maybe it would help if we start by sort of defining what we mean by utilitarianism.
Right.
Because I think people, especially people who are critical of it, often mean something different by that word than some of those of us who are more sympathetic to it, right? So what I mean by utilitarianism is just this moral view that says, in moral philosophy, we're trying to work out what the right thing to do is, and utilitarianism just gives a very simple answer. The right thing to do is whatever leads to the most well-being overall. And by well-being, we just mean whatever makes people's lives go better. Okay? So this is like one of the things, I guess, that attracted me to it, but also a reason that a lot of people are suspicious of it is that it does give this one single simple answer to sort of all the questions of morality, right? What's the right thing to do in any situation? Utilitarians just give this same answer. Whatever's going to lead to the most overall well-being, whatever's going to make people's lives better by the biggest margin, right? And the theoretical simplicity is something that attracts me to. Also, utilitarianism has this like quite deep commitment to a kind of equality between people, right? So when we're thinking about what is meant by improving well-being overall, utilitarians follow this dictum originally from Jeremy Bentham that says everybody is to count for one and none for more than one. So your well-being, my well-being, the well-being of the King of England, the well-being of a peasant in Malawi, all of our well-being like counts the same, right? So if you can do something that's going to improve the life of the peasant, but at some cost to the well-being of the king, and the amount that it would improve the life of the peasant is slightly more than the amount that it would reduce the well-being of the king, then you should do it, right? And obviously, you can see in Bentham's day, like 200 years ago, that sort of equality was quite a radical statement, right? Another thing I like about utilitarianism is its responsiveness to facts. So it doesn't just say, look, certain kinds of acts are always wrong, or certain kinds of acts are always right. It says, what's right or wrong depends on the facts of the situation. In particular, the facts about which actions would actually lead to the most well-being being created, right? So as we learn more about social science, medical science, and so on, and those facts might change, what you ought to do changes with it. And I think that responsiveness to facts is really important. And the final thing I really like about utilitarianism is its willingness to face up to trade-offs. Okay, so say you have go back to this king and peasant example. So you've got an action that harms someone but benefits someone else. Say, you're reducing the amount of tax that the peasant has to pay to the king, right? And it's going to mean the king has to, give up one of his many palaces, but it's going to mean the peasant can eat, an extra meal each week. A lot of theories are going to struggle to compare these two different things. They say, it harms some people, it benefits others. What are we going to do? Utilitarianism says, look, in some way, and this is controversial, like we can weigh up and commensurate the harms and benefits to different people. So we can say that this policy would benefit the peasant more than it would harm the king, and therefore it's a good policy, right? And I think in public policy and politics generally, like these trade-offs are just everywhere. There are very few policies that are, very good for everyone. They're all benefit and no harm, right? Anything we do, there's going to be some people who don't like it. There's going to be some people who are made worse off. There's going to be some rules or traditions that it comes into conflict with. And utilitarianism says, okay, in those situations, what you've got to say is like, do the benefits outweigh the costs? I think that's really important in public policy. So I think it's because of this that utilitarianism has had like a very large influence on public policy, certainly from the 19th century Britain and the British Empire. It was hugely influential. It's been influential in philosophy, in law, and to some degree in economics as well. But as you said, it's often sort of maligned in the philosophical discussion these days. It's one of these theories that like everyone comes across when you start studying moral philosophy, right? And then it becomes a bit of a uh, becomes sort of a target to attack,
target. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And the main attacks, I mean, some people just, don't believe that such a simple theory can do so much work. But the most common objections probably are that it's in some ways too permissive. So it permits us to maybe commit sort of what seem like heinous acts for the greater good, right? So the classic example here is like a doctor has 5 patients, each needs an organ transplant. Healthy man walks into the doctor's surgery. Seems like the doctor kills the healthy man and uses their organs to save the lives of these other 5 people. Well, look, let's think of the utilitarian trade-offs here. You've got one person's death on one side, but the benefits seem to be saving 5 people's lives. It looks like the utilitarian says, look, the doctor should kill the guy and take his organs. Most people think that seems wrong. So utilitarianism seems to permit, like, acts that we intuitively think are wrong for the greater good. Okay, so that's one sort of species of objections. We can talk more about how utilitarians might respond to that. And then another species of objections is that it doesn't permit enough, right? So certain mundane acts that everyone does seem to be wrong on the utilitarian sort of calculation, right? So, for example,
I think we lost you there for a bit. You said, for example, and then after
okay,
that we lost you there. Just repeat that bit if you don't mind. Yeah.
okay, yeah, great. So the other objection is that utilitarianism isn't going to permit certain mundane acts that we think are okay or even good. So, for example, say you have $20, you spend it on buying a present for your daughter. Okay, makes her happier. It's an expression of your love for your daughter. It's just a regular thing for a parent to do. No one thinks that's wrong, right? But it seems like, according to the utilitarian, it might be wrong because that $20 could have been used to produce more well-being, right? Yes, it's made your daughter happier, but if you'd spent it on something else, maybe it would have improved well-being overall. For instance, what if you'd given it to a charitable organization that, like, such as Give Directly? What Give Directly does is it just sends cash transfers to people in very poor countries. Now, $20 to someone in a very poor country means a lot more than a $20 present to your daughter. And so it seems like utilitarianism says the right thing to do here would have been to donate that money to Give Directly rather than to buy a present for your daughter. And that buying a present for your daughter, moreover, is morally wrong. And a lot of people also balk at that, right? That's very counterintuitive. What could be wrong about buying a present for your daughter? So these are the probably the two most common objections to utilitarianism, and I think they're why a lot of philosophers sort of want to come up with a moral theory that can accommodate those intuitions we have about those cases, and that's why they reject utilitarianism.
Excellent. I think this is the perfect segue, in fact, to your dissertation, because I think it's quite funny with utilitarianism, as you did point out rightly so, Nikhil, that it is sort of the kind of the common target from regardless of your political positions, be it right wing or left wing. The utilitarians are always the bad guys, so to speak. And one reason I've seen, and I'll give you a few examples here. One reason I've seen from more like right wing people is this idea of like telescope philanthropy, and then Charles Dickens, his novel, the way he talks about this idea that, oh, you care about what's happening in some country far away, but you don't care about your neighbor. You don't care about the immediate, what's immediately taking place. It kind of left wing, let's say, critique is it's more this the critique which we'll discuss, I'm sure, that the effective altruists get regarding, oh, it's just the idea is, you focus on individuals accumulating a lot of money and trying to, in a utilitarian manner, distribute the money, and there's not enough structural critique. And also they too bring in this idea of, okay, what about yeah, does the nature of a human being, whatever that nature may be, and if there is such a nature, does it fit with a normative theory like utilitarianism? So, of course, your dissertation, I misspoke before. I said human nature, but it's actually utilitarianism and the social nature of persons. So, along with what I said, if you could kind of address that critique, that big critique, that the idea of, whatever a human being is, can they, practically partake in a utilitarian sort of society? And then secondly, maybe we could use that to kind of explore what you explored in your dissertation pertaining more to the social nature of a person's, and then it'll go on from there, Nikhil, if that's okay.
I guess what I'm trying to do in my dissertation is provide a response to, I guess, these two worries. You characterize them as right wing and left wing there. The one
Just
is
for
to
the sake of
criticize
conversation. I'm not, that's just for the sake of
Sure.
conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first is to criticize the extreme impartiality of utilitarianism. As you put it, like you care about people on the other side of the world just as much as you care about, yourself or your own family. Seems like there's seems like that might sort of run against human nature in some way. And the second, the more sort of what you characterize as a left-wing critique, that utilitarianism is too individualistic. Now, I actually think that and what I argue in my dissertation is that if we emphasize the importance of the social connections between individuals, then we can solve sort of both of these problems that utilitarianism seems to have, right? What I mean by the importance of the social connections between individuals is that everything I do that makes me the person I am is done in a social context that is built up of lots of other people, of their actions, of the meanings that through language and thought and tradition we create together. In the modern world, just materially, we rely on so many other people for everything we do every day, right? So where did your coffee come from this morning, right? What about all the materials in the microphone that you're using to record this podcast, right? Millions of other people, when you look through these supply chains, right, are integral to like how we each live and the projects that we ourselves have. And moreover, it's our connections with other people that give our lives meaning.
Meaning, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of key insight, right? This sort of idea, philosophers have said this. There's versions of this in philosophers for a long time and in many different traditions. But like, one slogan you hear is like, no man is an island, right? We're all connected up together, and what makes you is other people and their myriad relations to you. Right. So once we keep that in mind, it seems to me that the idea of taking seriously the well-being of people who are not immediate to you, so not you or your family or your immediate neighbor, but people across this global society, appears sort of not in this sense of like I'm giving up something close to me for the sake of something far away for this other person I don't know about, but rather an expression of the fact that in the modern world, we are all part of one. We are all part of one sort of social collective,
Yeah.
right? And everything that everything that I do can be an expression of that. And so there's this worry, this sort of right-wing worry that that's somehow opposed to human nature. I want to, because there's this thought that human nature is sort of selfish or myopic, right? We care about ourselves, we care about the things we can see close to us. And I want to say, obviously, people often do have those biases, but on reflection, the self and those close to us are not something that you can easily separate from society at large and the people far away from us.
Yeah.
And once we recognize that, making those sorts of trade-offs between those different groups seems a lot more reasonable. Now, onto that more left-wing worry about thought that utilitarianism has a problem with structural change. I basically agree that this is true of the sort of contemporary utilitarianism associated with, say, people like Peter Singer. So their thought is, look, society is how it is. What can I do? What contribution can I make as an individual to improve the world as much as possible? By which, specifically in this utilitarian view, is increase the amount of well-being in the world as much as possible. That's a very individualistic view of action, right? And what that means is it sort of takes off the table certain kinds of systemic change, right? Because say that you think that there's a problem that, some people are very rich and some people are very poor. This is not good for overall well-being.
Like the world we live in.
It will be right, exactly. So it would be as we talked about before, like $20 means much more to a poor person than a rich person. So it seems like there's a utilitarian case for redistribution there, right? The sort of individualistic utilitarian is going to say, okay, so that means you have a duty to donate your $20 to give direct. But what they're not able to say is, hang on, why don't we change the system so that we don't have very rich people and very poor people, but instead we have an economy that tends to produce more equality, right? And why can't they say that? Well, it's because that's not the kind of thing that it's in one individual's gift to do, right? You want to change our social and economic system, that's going to have to be done by a huge organized collective of people, right? The whole society acting together, or at least a large part of it, right? A social movement or a class, right? Um, Now, if we start thinking in terms of those sorts of agents, right? So not just like, what can I do to maximize well-being in the world, but what can we do together, right? As a society or as a political party, as a movement, as a class, what can we do together to improve the world? Then these more systemic, more ambitious changes seem much more tracked, right? And so what I'm arguing in my dissertation is that both of these problems can be solved by thinking about basically the collective and social nature of individuals.
Yeah, perfect. I think we can delve a bit deeper into that as we go, because obviously, I mean, if you want, you can comment on this. But one person that's sort of like, let's say the antithesis to your thesis is Bernard Williams, and you sort of address his criticisms of utilitarianism. However, Nikhil, I would like to explore a bit more this idea of well. I'd probably first say this. I probably fall into the more left-wing camp in their
Mhm.
critique of utilitarianism. I do believe, in many ways, in the Marxian sense, that true significant social change only happens collectively. I mean, I don't buy this idea of sort of the one great person, the great, Napoleon-like figure who has the world's spirit taken up by a storm and just changes the world radically. I think a lot of change is in fact structural, it's social, and perhaps there's the radical version of that theory or that worldview would be that ideas don't change the world, but material circumstances change the world, and then in retrospect, we have ideas to rationalize what's already been. I think Nietzsche even makes this point, in fact, in his Gay
Mhm.
Science.
Mhm.
But I know you said you don't want to comment too much on these speculative questions, but forgive me, I've got a utilitarian philosopher, so I feel obliged to
Sure.
ask you this. This idea that comes probably more from the right wing, which for me has always been a bit absurd because forget about psychoanalysis or all these theories, just day to day, experientially, I've seen so many times where people clearly aren't acting in self-interest. People clearly partake in self-destructive behavior. I think the kids these days call it self-sabotage. Yeah, that's the term, right? So you'd see it in relationships, you'd see it in work, you'd see it when someone starts something new. People do have this almost self-destructive tendency. I think it's a part of human nature. I think Kafka wrote about it beautifully. Lot of literature, Dostoevsky writes of this idea that there's something almost irrational to our existence, and that's where I think this idea of the social nature gets really interesting. Because again, I misspoke initially. You don't speak of human nature; you speak of social nature, and I'm coming to realize, and correct me if I'm wrong here. Those for you are very different things. The social nature it's probably a different category. So to be succinct, forgive me, how would you respond to that kind of argument that human beings don't act in their self-interest and we even in a more radical sense have this self-destructive tendency where we do things that clearly go against our well-being in some sense, as Dostoevsky said in Notes from Underground,
Mhm.
man falls in love with suffering in a very dramatic sense if he puts it. So what's your kind of counterpoint or your views on that, let's say?
Yeah, great. So maybe just clarify what I'm talking about social nature and
It's a
human
good
nature.
idea. Yeah, yeah, yes, please.
Um, so people have this idea of human nature. This has like stronger and weaker forms, right? The weaker form, which I think I agree with, and I think most people would agree with, is that like there is some way that human beings are, and it's not sort of infinitely malleable, right? You can't. There's some things that you just like can't make human beings into, no matter sort of how you educate them, what sort of society they're raised in, and so on, right? So people are, and that's surely true in some sense, right? Like we're all of the nature that like if you put a hand in a flame, it will burn, and we won't like that, right? It's like that is just like the nature of how we are. But then some people have a much stronger view of human nature, right? That extends to sort of a much wider range of social behaviors and attitudes. So people say things like, "Oh, it's just yeah, human nature to be selfish," um, or you see, oh, it's human nature to want to compete with others, or it's human nature for men to want to have as many female partners as possible. Or, you see these sorts of claims. Those those I'm highly skeptical of, right? Because I think if you study any history or anthropology or sociology, like that will just tell you that in different social setups with different sort of ways of living, people do get different attitudes and preferences and so on. And so that brings us on to the question of what I mean by the social nature of persons. And I guess what I mean is, here's a weak claim about human nature. A weak claim about human nature is that what we are and how we live is determined by and formed in collaboration with other people around us, right? Without them, we wouldn't have the same meanings to our activities, right? There's certain activities you just can't do on your own, or if you do them on your own and no one else cares, like they don't have so much meaning, right? You can't really make art without an audience for it, for instance, those sorts of things. We think our thinking is obviously like often determined by language, which only makes sense in a society. The work we do only really makes sense if there's other people sort of consuming the products of our
Recognition,
labor,
yeah.
and we rely on everyone else producing the things that like help us to subsist,
Yeah, and
right?
I would also add, if it's
So that's yeah.
no, sorry, I was just going to say
No,
one
go
other
ahead.
really, I think, important thing here is, sorry for the interruption, the cognitive philosopher Andy Clark, he makes the point of the extended mind, where even our
Great.
decision making is very much, we almost outsource our decision making to our social world. So even something that we think is our most deep, intimate decision is in some sense influenced by our social reality. I just thought that'd be important to add too, but please continue, Nikhil.
Great, yeah. So we're getting new theories and new results all the time that just show like how much we rely on other people, right? Okay, so that's a weak claim about human nature, is that like what we do sort of is hugely dependent on other people, right? That's what I mean by there's a social nature of individuals. Now, this also explains why the stronger claims about human nature don't really work, right? Because, okay, put us in a different social environment, we're going to have different outcomes from that, right? We're going to become a different kind of person, right? So you can take someone with, my exact DNA, raised me in um, 16th century France, contemporary China, um, all the very different social environments to one I was actually raised in of early 21st century UK, or even just raised me in a different family within that one society, or exposed me to different things, raised me around different people, and because my identity is so socially mediated, right? I'm going to come out quite different, right? So then these stronger claims about human nature seem to falter. Now, what does this mean? I mean, you mentioned in particular the claim that sort of it's human nature to be sort of mostly interested in one's own well-being and
Well,
do what's good for
I,
yourself, right?
I was sort of, in some sense, rephrasing or reiterating the right-wing
Mm,
claim. Now, I don't agree
right,
with
yeah.
that. What I was trying to say was, well, there's something even beyond that where it seems that we aren't even interested in our own well-being too. However, and I'm sorry to kind of go on a bit of a tangent here. I think through your this category, through your concept of the social nature, that too could be,
Mm,
you could even argue against that, saying that yes, because human nature is so murky, the social nature could fundamentally change the so-called human nature of a person, because it's not a given kind of an objective fact of brutal fact of the universe of being as such. Regardless, yeah, continue, Nikhil.
yeah, so let's go back to this claim that there's some sort of natural impulse to look after our own well-being. So this could be spun as like good or bad for utilitarianism, right? So I think you're spinning it in the way that it seems bad because utilitarianism says, um, look, the right thing to do is to maximize overall well-being, not just your own. And sometimes that might mean, we talked about trade-offs again, sacrificing some of your own well-being for the good of other people, right? And I said how like that can be made to seem more reasonable by noting the ways in which yourself and other people are intimately connected for all these social connections, right? Um, so is it a worry if it's like human nature to look after your own well-being, but a moral theory tells us to look after everyone's well-being? Well, that depends on sort of the place that you think moral theory should have. Right. I know there are some philosophers who are going to say, look, I don't care about human nature. What I'm saying is what the right thing to do is. If people don't do it,
It's their
that's on
fault.
them. They've done the
Yeah,
wrong thing,
yeah.
So the correct moral theory is the correct moral theory. Human nature is human nature. And if they don't match up, all that shows is that we're all sinners, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure I do agree with that, right? I think moral theory should have something to say to the kind of creatures that we are,
For
right?
sure.
So if it actually is the case that it's impossible or just feels awful to follow a moral theory because of something about how humans are, right? Then I do think that's a problem for the moral theory, right? So that means I'm going to have to say something to the effect that humans don't need to be selfish in this way. Um, and yeah, I mean, you were pointing to ways in which people's like people can be self-destructive, right? And I would also point to the ways in which people can be altruistic, right?
That's fair.
You just see this all the time. People do things that are not really in their interests, right? People, stand in line in the rain to cast a vote in an election because they think one candidate is better for the country than the other candidate. And they don't get anything really out of voting, right? But they give up their time to do it, right? People people look after other people, not just
Common
not
decency.
just their family members,
Yeah.
but within families in particular, you see this. People donate money to charity. People there's a whole range of altruistic behaviors that people engage in, and what I think is going to be important in making society better in terms of this idea of overall well-being is going to be harnessing those more altruistic motivations that people do have and making that a larger part of our society and economy, and decreasing the sort of selfish motivations that
I
people have.
I couldn't agree more, and this is why I think I was trying to demarcate between human nature and social nature. Nikhil, the reason being because for me, even let's say the most self-destructive act we could think of, a person committing suicide. That's the
Sure.
end. There's nothing beyond that, right? But you could even argue, I mean, we can't live in a utopian society. However, if the reason a person does such a thing is because they're deeply suffering inside, they're in a deep sense of existential pain, and it's unbearable. It could be due to social circumstances. It could be due to economic strife. It could be due to a variety of things. It could be due to the fact that climate change anxiety, or the anxiety of just our volatile, capricious times in the political atmosphere, or it could be the social media. I mean, there have been many cases where social media has directly led people to self-harm or even committing suicide. So, and all of that, in my view, is still a part of the social nature of a person, and that directly impacts what we call the human nature. And as you rightly argue, yes, we could structurally, through a utilitarian ethic, even create a society that perhaps allows people to bring out more of their altruistic side than this other self-destructive side. So I think that's a good category that you've kind of created, which I do appreciate, Nikhil. This is again another really good segue because I'll put an overlay for the listeners. Well, in this case, for the people on YouTube. So if you're a listener, do check out the YouTube channel of your mind map or for left utilitarianism. This is kind of your handwritten mind map, which I kind of enjoyed. And it's kind of an ongoing research project for you. So if you could
Yep.
kind of talk about, so now that we've discussed what utilitarianism is, what is left utilitarianism, and how does that differ from more of the general, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill kind of way of viewing utilitarianism?
Yeah, great. So left utilitarianism is just a sort of a name that I've come up with for this sort of research program that I'm pursuing. And the overarching thought, right, is to bring utilitarianism together with ideas from the socialist tradition,
Yeah.
right? So one of these things we've already talked about, right? So socialists tend to emphasize the importance of social connections between people, right? The fact that we're all connected, that we all sort of mutually depend on one another's cooperation. That's a huge part of socialist thought, right? And in my dissertation, I use that to resist some of these worries about utilitarian impartiality, right? Because they say, well, since we all like co-create each other's selves, it need not be alienating to, put other people's welfare ahead of your own, or at least you're on a par with your own, and it's close to you because, we are all connected. Okay. But that's just one aspect of this research program, right? So other things that socialists have emphasized, the importance of collective agency. So I'm really interested in collective action problems, which again we touched on a little bit, talking about this like left-wing critique about structural change, which I think in effect is a collective action problem, and something that socialists have often emphasized is that important questions in ethics and politics are not necessarily about what can I do, but what can we do? What can we do together? And thinking about agents such as trade unions or the working classes or states or social movements, as well as individual agents. Then a third strand is, when I introduced utilitarianism, I said, look, utilitarianism has this very simple answer to all moral questions. The right thing to do is whatever maximizes well-being. Now, one thing that people often ask there is, well, is it really that simple? Because now you've got to tell me what well-being is, right? And well-being, I just characterize it as like whatever makes people's lives go better and worse. But there's lots of different theories about what sort of things make people's lives go better or worse, right? So some people think it's so to take a sort of something that sort of leads to disagreement, some people think it makes your life a lot better to have children. Some people don't think that's something that makes your life better. You can be perfectly happy without children. It's just like a disagreement about what the components of welfare are, right? Now, I think socialists have given a particular view about at least what some of the things that make up a good life are, right? So socialists tend to emphasize the importance of our relations to other people and the quality of those relations as being key to leading a good life, right? In particular, those relationships being ones of equality, right? And not of hierarchy, domination, exploitation, and oppression, right? So the socialist view of the good life, cooperation and community with other people who you relate to as equals, okay? And that fills in some of this idea of well-being, and I think it gives an attractive picture of well-being that's distinct from, say, ideas that equate like living a good life with having lots of money or being famous or successful, and so on, right? And I think that has implications for public policy, right? Because if what we want to do primarily is improve people's lives in this kind of way, that's you may favor sort of more egalitarian public policies, trying to break up sort of hierarchies, more than simply like pursuing, say, economic growth.
Yeah, in fact, I just want to add something here, Nikhil. Curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of what you just said, public policy not merely pursuing economic growth. I've been talking to a few philosophers of education on this podcast, and one
Right.
point they make is that, in fact, because of Thatcherism and Reaganism, kind of the neoliberal order, the university itself, which is supposed to be an institution of knowledge, of learning, of discovering and creating new knowledge, has tends to sometimes become more like a corporation where I'm sure you've seen this, just generally speaking, that the colloquially speaking, people talk of university that it's a means to an end to get a job. And I find
Mhm.
that deeply problematic because the idea is then that the only social service of the university is simply to create more employees. Ergo, that leading to people working, fulfilling uh, roles in some corporation and more economic growth. And then the question would be, well, does that sit along with this idea of human well-being and the fact that we humans are not only merely workers who just want to consume and work and consume more, but rather we almost, as Immanuel Kant said, we are almost transcendental beings. We have a conscience, a moral law within, and we want to engage in art and poetry and philosophy, and it's not just purely accumulation. So for me, and the thing is, I think Marx himself, I believe in Capital, he even writes of this. He says that people need more free time, more leisure to engage in these things. And he says the problem is the proletariat, they don't have this. And that's where again, I think I'm getting at I'm getting at where you're coming from. A term used in Marxist kind of Marxist language or Marxian language is the idea of class solidarity. And
Mhm.
in fact, you're probably the first person I came across who even speaks of socialism as a card carrying utilitarian philosopher because utilitarians don't speak of things like class solidarity or the fact that, well, we aren't just individuals acting in this world amongst other rational agents, kind of the game theoretic way, but rather we are a part of a social group. Now, they may call it a class, but of course we can expand it into a variety of, race, gender, depending on our historical circumstance. So I'm curious to kind of explore a bit more. What do you think utilitarians can learn from socialists and kind of Marxian philosophy?
Yeah, great. Well, why don't I? Okay, there was a few things there. So one thing was about the role of universities in society,
Yeah, sorry, I think two things
um,
there. Yeah.
and how that connects to a view of the good life, and then we had this question about, yeah. So what can utilitarians learn from Marx? So yeah, so this sort of view of the good life that I outlined. So a life with autonomy, healthy relations with other people, egalitarian relations with other people, right? Not being dominated and exploited by others, and not doing that dominating and exploiting
Correct.
yourself. I think that also makes your life worse, right? So I would say, like being on top of a hierarchy is not, I think, the thing that makes your life go better. The thing that makes your life go better is having friendly and equal
Yeah,
relationships with
yeah,
other people, right?
I agree.
Um, that's not all of what makes your life go better. And I don't want to sound like I'm too skeptical or dismissing of like the importance of financial security and economic growth,
Material conditions.
and income, right? The material conditions are super important, right? Clearly, like if you don't have enough money to eat, like that is going to be bad for you, right? And there's a lot of people in the world who don't have that, right? And one way of reducing their numbers, um, as in by reducing, I mean, re by reducing their numbers, I mean giving people enough to eat. Reducing the numbers of people who don't have enough to eat.
Yeah,
Um,
you can't enjoy
one way of
Chopin or read
one way, yeah,
Shakespeare on an empty
yeah,
stomach.
one way of yeah, exactly. So like one way of doing that is economic growth. So I don't understand like I'm too skeptical about that. What I'm saying is like, you know, yes, you want people to have a degree of like material security, um, But that's a means to an end in itself, and the end is these other things that make life worth living, right? And you talked about leisure, talked about relationships, um, freedom, right? Having money is good because it gets you all those things. It's not good in itself, right? And that means that, you know, a good life is one with all these different sorts of goods in it. And money isn't the only thing. And that does have an impact for like so say like, what I tell my students about like what are you trying to get out of university? And you're absolutely right that a lot of people do come to university with this idea that it's a means to an end, and the end here is like a well-paying corporate job. Yeah. So I'm going to get through this course. I'm going to get a piece of paper that's going to get me a well-paying corporate job. And that's not the way I think one should look at a university education at all. I think universities are rather special places in our society, in that they are, despite the changes that we've seen to them in the neoliberal era, universities still are a part of society that is relatively well insulated from market forces. And what that means is there are people at universities with the time and space to do deep thinking and engage in interesting experiments and activities that are not connected to simply making more profits. And that means there's stuff going on in universities that you don't get outside of universities, right? And I don't just mean like the academic research, I also mean like the things like the student societies, student politics, all this extracurricular stuff. So what I say to my students is like, make the most of your time at university, by which I don't mean like get the best grades possible for the least work possible and go and get your piece of paper and get into the best paying corporate job possible. I mean, explore all these other things that universities can offer that make life worth living, right? Expanding the mind, expanding the kinds of relationships you have with other people. So that's my rant about universities. Now, now the question of the connection between utilitarianism and Marxism, and what utilitarians have to learn from Marxists and socialists more generally. So, look, utilitarians say that we should look out for other people. We should treat their welfare as being equally important as the welfare of ourselves and our families. As we've discussed, some people find this like a really difficult thing to swallow, right? Now, I've suggested like, here's how you could make it a less difficult thing to swallow, right? Don't think of these other people, maybe on the other side of the world that you're meant to, care about the welfare of. Don't think of them as just like some sort of foreign other. Think of them as a common part of a social collective, which is also what makes you you. And it makes them that. And your work is consumed by them, and their work is consumed by you. And Marx has this brilliant, beautiful line, I think, in his critique of James Mill, actually, the father of the great utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill.
Yeah.
Right. But Marx says, in the ideal sort of society, our products would be like so many mirrors out of which we could shine, right? And what he means by this is like, I produce things for you, you produce things for me, and that actually leads to us both becoming better off, right? We both become better off because we both have not only the stuff, right? I have the stuff that you produce for me, you have the stuff that I produce for you, but we both have the joy of being able to produce something that's meaningful for someone else,
Yeah,
right?
the
And I
reciprocity.
think, right, exactly. Reciprocity, or we might put it in terms of solidarity as well, right? So when utilitarians are making these demands on people, right, saying, look, sometimes, that $20 that you could have spent on yourself or your daughter, you should give it to someone else for whom it would make more difference to their well-being, right? That demand seems very alienating if you just think of this other person as some other person, right? But if you think of them as someone like you, together in a society in which we're all cooperating together, then you helping them can be in itself like a joyous expression of this connection and solidarity, right? So I think that's something that utilitarians can take from Marx, right? Is that if we want people to treat each other well, we have to ask them to see one another as intimately connected in ways that make our lives meaningful. The second thing that I think utilitarians can take from Marx is this stuff about collective action, and you mentioned like class solidarity here, right? Is that, look, there are some things that would make the world a lot better in terms of well-being, and so utilitarians should want to do. That can only be achieved by a large number of coordinated individuals working together and thinking of themselves not as individuals, but as members of a class, right? You wanna overthrow the system. One person's not going to be able to do that. You're going to need a movement to do that. And you're going to need each person in the movement not to think, what can I do to maximize my marginal contribution here, but to think, what are we all doing together? Right. And I think that's something else that utilitarians can take from Marx. I think it's something that's sort of really missing from contemporary utilitarianism, particularly in its sort of more effective altruist sort of modes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the next thing, obviously, the next a huge thing that I want to discuss with you, Nikhil. However, just one last question on this relationship between utilitarianism and Marxism. I want to talk a bit more, and I don't think we'll be able to go too deeply into this, just on the role of the state. Now, Marx, of course, influenced by the great German idealist Hegel. Hegel, in the philosophy of right, I haven't read that text too carefully, but I do know that he defends
It's
the
very hard.
state. It's a very, I mean, Hegel, he's obscure. Um, but he certainly he's a statist. He defends the state, and he's some kind of very vanilla monarchist even. Now I don't know Marxists. They're myriad. They're kind of anarcho Marxists. There are the Marxists, the dictatorship of the proletariat, variety of theories. But I'm curious. Let's just say from the place you're coming from, what are your views on the state? Because again, that example you brought up before, Nikhil, about this
Mm.
idea of trading where it can be a reciprocal kind of trade, reciprocal kind of trade, sorry. Because for me, see, that argument could also be made by kind of the laissez-faire, neoliberal, free market tier, right? You could just like people are just trading,
Great.
no mediation, no intervention by the state or by the government. Now, I still think kind of the idea of the Marxist version would not have even this idea of trading per se, even though it's very idealistic, I know, given the world we live in. Again, I'm curious, though, what role do you think the state plays in a utilitarian society?
So I think it's important to distinguish, especially when we're talking about Marx, between what we might think an ideal society looks like and what we think it would be good to do now, given all the facts about our existing society. Right.
For sure.
So Marxists actually talk very little about the former of those, right? Which is kind of interesting. Like a lot of people have the idea, oh, socialists, they're like, you know, idealists. It sounds good in theory, but it won't work in practice, etc. It's very common criticism.
Well, I think we lost you there, Nikhil.
As soon as you talk very little about okay.
Sorry, mate. You may have to. I
Where
think
should I start back
the
from?
the common criticism that Marxists don't talk about
Right.
uh
Okay.
the kind of the real world what's happening right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. So it's important to distinguish those two things, the ideal society and what should we do right now, given all the facts about our society. It's sort of ironic that a common criticism of the far left that you hear is like, oh, they're idealists, they've got their heads in the clouds, it's a nice idea in theory, but it won't work in practice. If you spend time actually reading any Marxist literature, you realize they're obsessed about like what will work in practice and spend very little time talking about sort of what their ideals would be. So like in terms of the state, I think you can find things in the Marxist tradition like, Engels saying, under communism the state will wither away, right? This idea that I think Marx mentions in Capitals very briefly, this idea of just like groups of workers sort of freely associating. So there is this sort of like anarchistish sort of tendency there, but they don't talk about it very much. And why not? Well, because they're interested not in designing ideal societies primarily, but in thinking about here and now, given the circumstances, what should we be doing? And I think whether you're a socialist, Marxist, utilitarian, I don't think it's escapable at the moment, given the way our society is and the tasks that we have to solve. I don't think it's escapable that we need states. And in fact, I think in many ways we need to increase the power of states because going back to what you mentioned about sort of this neoliberal era, I think in the neoliberal era you've got basically for the last 40 years, pretty much everywhere around the world, you've had the role of the state in the economy being diminished and diminished. And what's replaced it is not freedom. What's replaced it is the dominance of private corporations.
Corporate
right?
system and crony capitalism.
Right, exactly. And like, states have their problems. There's lots of criticisms one can make of the state. But there's no reason to think that private corporations are going to be superior with respect to freedom and democracy and equality, right? At least states can have, elected governments. At least they're meant to look out for the welfare.
Sorry, I lost you again there. You
Frozen
said
after that.
yeah, hold up. I think you said at least a state. I lost
Yeah.
you there.
So yeah, there's no reason to think the domination of private companies is going to be better than the domination of states, especially if those states can be made democratic and can be made responsive to the needs of their populations. Whereas even the best run corporation is responsive to the needs of its shareholders, right? Primarily.
Correct.
And so um that's why sort of in the even if you think the ideal society like is stateless as maybe Marx did, um you can't really escape the need for a state at the moment to at least like take on and regulate and tax these large corporations which dominate so much of our lives. I suspect that even in an ideal society, we will need something like a state. It may look very different to what we've got, to the sort of states we have now. Ideally, it would be sort of uh, less violent, less authoritarian, right? But you need, and this comes back to collective action problems. You need some way of solving collective action problems.
It seems like the connection keeps getting worse, unfortunately. Where
Sure,
will we?
sure.
So, I think the gist of the argument certainly was clear. The idea
I
that the
think
state
collective action problems. Yeah,
collective
sure.
action for sure. And it's funny. While we lost connection, I was just thinking, both the philosophies or theories that you're working with, utilitarianism and Marxism, they both have this common line of attack, which is that they're too idealistic. They think too much in abstract idyllic futures. But if you really look at the literature, it's it's contrarily rather more structural everyday critiques trying to understand what's going on in the
Yeah.
in the society we live in, not in like any abstract sense. Um, and that makes a lot of sense for sure. Excellent. So let me see. Now that we okay, when we are a bit close to, can we go for another around 15 more minutes? Nikhil, is that okay? Just with the
Sure,
connection, or even a
sure.
bit longer? Excellent. Thank you, mate. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really want to
I've got
cover.
plenty of time.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you. Cheers. Because the big part of what I want to cover is, in fact, effective altruism, and we haven't even got
yeah,
to that
great.
yet.
Yeah, let's do that.
uh,
Let's do that.
so I should mention, obviously, as I did say before, I came across you through your post on the EA forum, the effective altruism forum, and what you said was, well, why not socialism? You kind of posted that question, and then you said maybe effective altruists should consider socialism. So, if there are any people in the EA community listening, which I'm sure there will be a few, given the title and how YouTube algorithms work, it'll be sent to their feed. Yeah, why socialism for a movement like effective altruism?
Yeah, great. So maybe for people who aren't familiar, let's just define effective altruism.
Good
So
idea.
this is a movement. I guess its philosophical roots are in people like Peter Singer, um, Will MacAskill. These are moral philosophers, basically working in the utilitarian tradition. And effective altruism is a movement, I would say, that basically encourages people to do the most good that they can. And largely this means charitable giving to charities that save lives or improve lives as cheaply as possible. So this is somewhat connected to utilitarianism. As I said, some of the sort of founders of EA are utilitarian philosophers, but you don't have to be a utilitarian to be an effective altruist, right? You can think it's really important to give money to effective charities without thinking that, say, all moral questions can be solved by this appeal to maximizing overall well-being, right? So, so it's somewhat connected, but EA as a movement is not all EAs are utilitarians. I think that's worth saying. Now I have a mixture of feelings about the effective altruist movement. As I said, I'm sympathetic to utilitarianism, so I agree with a lot of their philosophical claims. But I think they have this problem that I mentioned earlier about contemporary utilitarianism, and that they think into individualistic terms, and this leads to certain blind spots. And one of these is what I was trying to talk about on that effective altruism forum post, which I called, sort of in homage to the philosopher Jerry Cohen, why not socialism? And here's the way I started off. I said, look, if you're an effective altruist, it seems like you've got to believe that the current way in which we distribute economic resources in the world is bad, right? Otherwise, why would effective altruism be necessary? Right? Why would it be necessary for people to give money to effective charities if it weren't the case that the money isn't in the right place, the most effective place to start with? Okay. So, and then I said, an effective altruist must also believe that it's possible to redistribute economic resources and get people to change their behavior based on.
Yep,
Okay,
lost
yeah.
you again there. So you're sorry, Nikhil. The second part, I'm not sure why the internet's this bad today. This rarely happens to me. I think the second point you
Yeah.
made,
Okay.
that's
No, it
where
could be my end.
that's okay. I'll
Okay. Yeah.
edit all of this
Let's.
out. The second
Yeah.
part of it is where we missed you. So
No,
you
no,
could
no.
repeat the
Okay.
second part, please. Yeah.
I'll repeat again. Then the other thought is, well, effective altruists must also believe that it's possible to get people to change their economic behavior based on altruistic motivations, right? Because otherwise, how could effective altruism be possible, right? Why would there be any point in encouraging people to give away their money if everyone always just acted in self-interested ways around money? So putting these two things together, we get effective altruists must all believe the current way of distributing money in the global economy is bad, and people can change their economic behavior based on altruistic motives. Now, if you believe both of those two things, it seems natural to then believe that we should change the way that the current economic system works in a way that expands the role of altruistic and cooperative behavior in the economy. But just another word for that is socialism, right? That's what socialists believe. That we should have a different kind of economic system that relies less on selfish motivation and more on cooperative motivations. So the puzzle then is, given that effective altruists believe these things about the economy, why are most effective altruists sort of like not socialists? Why are they sort of hostile to socialism? Or why do they recommend sort of charitable giving rather than sort of joining the socialist movement as the thing you can do best to improve the world? I had some thoughts about why that might be. But yeah, I'm interested. And I was genuinely interested to see what effective altruists could give me as explanations for like where they saw where they might see this argument going.
So yeah, please share away. What do you think? Well, firstly, what were your thoughts, if you don't mind sharing them publicly? But also after, because it's been a few months since you posted this on the forum, and you had quite a lot of engagement
Mhm.
with that post. What were some of the feedback you got? But also, let's say, why they were hostile towards socialism.
Yeah. So in terms of like why effective altruists aren't socialists, given that they want a redistribution of wealth and they think that altruism is possible, why don't they want a more altruistic and redistributive economic system? I have sort of one sort of cynical explanation and then two maybe more noble philosophical ones, right? So the cynical explanation is that, look, what effective altruism is, as a matter of social fact, whatever the people within it believe, is it's a movement of elites, right? So the social base of effective altruism is highly educated, highly wealthy white men in the global north.
How about we try it with the videos of Nikhil? How about maybe we could try that? Are you okay with that? Just with the video off?
Yeah, let's try that.
I think the overall argument you were making was, Nikhil, pertaining to the idea that it is more the cynical argument, or the cynical side would be it is a bit of an elitist movement.
So why would effective altruists, given that they believe that economic resources should be redistributed, and given that they believe that altruism is possible, why would they not be socialists? So I have sort of a more cynical and maybe more sort of noble explanations there. So the cynical explanation, and this goes back to like sort of Marx's sort of materialist way of thinking about politics, is, well, look at whose interests effective altruism represents, right? So effective altruism is ultimately a movement of elites, right? Its centers of power are the University of Oxford and the tech industry in Silicon Valley, right? It's a
Certainly.
movement of highly educated, very wealthy white men, right? And which is not a personal criticism of anyone involved. Loads of people involved in effective altruism care very deeply about people who are not part of the elites, but they are who they are, right? And they have certain biases as a result of that. Moreover, the effective altruist movement is massively reliant on billionaire funding, right? So quite a small number of billionaires actually supply a lot of the funding in the effective altruist movement, and so you can see that if you represent the interests of those sorts of groups, socialism is not going to be in the interests of those sorts of groups, right? Or not in the immediate interest. I think ultimately socialism's in everyone's interest, but it doesn't look like it's in the interests of people with lots of wealth and people at the top of the pyramid, right? To have a less hierarchical and system in which wealth is largely redistributed, right? So I think this probably explains a lot of the bias, whether it's conscious or not, a lot of the hostility to socialism. So that's a more cynical reason. But I think, and I definitely got this in sort of responses to that forum post, look, there are sort of more respectable philosophical reasons that effective altruists might be skeptical of socialism. One is simply that they think that, look, it turns out that capitalism works better, right? So, as I said, it doesn't seem to me that an effective altruist can consistently think that the current economic system is perfect, right? Otherwise, there will be no need for any charitable giving, right? There would be no need for a movement telling people where to send their money, because it would already be there, right? In a perfect system. So they must think that the current system's imperfect, but they might think that, something like the current system, a reformed kind of capitalism is, the best we can do, right? And better than socialistic alternatives. And here I just think, like, the evidence is sometimes oversold about the virtues of capitalism and the disasters of socialism, or the alleged disasters of socialism.
This I agree.
Um, we can talk a bit more about that if you like, but I think what I want to note here is that you don't have to deny that capitalism has been very good for human welfare in the past to think that it might not be the very best system we can have in the future,
Yes.
right? So, in fact, this is the Marxist view about capitalism, right? So that capitalism is better than what came before it, better
Feudalism
than
and
feudalism.
whatever the case was.
Yeah,
Yeah, all of them.
right. Great. But it puts us in a place where now we have a different set of technologies, a different set of social problems, a different set of social forces that allows us to get something even better going forwards, right? And yeah, we can discuss evidence, but I ultimately think my view here is just a more hopeful view than the view of the sort of capitalist effective altruists, right? Because I think I have a hope that we can actually do much better than a system like capitalism that's largely based on inequality and self-interest. And especially if you're a utilitarian, so you believe in you have this egalitarian flavor to your philosophical beliefs, as we discussed before, and you have this idea of impartiality rather than self-interest. It seems like that is what you should hope for. You should hope that we could form an economy that's more like that. I'm not saying there's conclusive evidence that socialism is going to be better than capitalism. I don't think it's the sort of thing you can have conclusive evidence for. So I'm happy to admit that my view rests on sort of hopeful optimism there. The second philosophical reason that people sort of pushed back against, the effective altruists pushed back against the idea of socialism goes back to something we discussed right towards the start of this conversation, right? This question of, is it the individual or the collective that's the locus of moral duties? So even if you thought that socialism's the better system, you might worry like, well, how can I as an individual change the economic system from capitalism to socialism? Doesn't seem like something I can do. Whereas sending $20 to Give Directly or the Against Malaria Foundation, that does seem like something I can do as an individual that will make the world better. So I don't deny that when you're thinking about things in these individualistic terms, the more traditional effective altruist thoughts of that donating to charity might be the best thing to do sort of look better. But what I want to say is that we should also incorporate into our moral ontologies, as in like what sort of agents are there morally, not just individuals but group agents as well. So as I've said before, not just thinking about what can I do to make the world better, but what can we do together to make the world better. And of course, these sort of big structural changes can and have been accomplished, right? They've not been accomplished by an individual. They've been accomplished by large groups, social movements, classes, political parties, and so on. And so if effective altruists allow themselves to think more collectively, I think that would make socialism look at sort of a lot better in their calculations.
Yes, and isn't it the case, Nikhil, that if you think of some of the most significant movements, even events in human history, civil rights, the women's suffragettes, they undoubtedly were collective movements. I mean, there was a lot of collective
Right.
organizing, collective action, class solidarity, whatever you may call it. And yeah, it could even be the fact that, I mean, this is probably a purely just a contingent cultural phenomena. Given that effective altruism, and I kind of got this from when I was reading the comments to your post on the forum,
Mhm.
given that it comes out of this milieu of, yes, kind of elitist tech people, academics, they all have this idea of like the self-made person, or I'm a individual who's pulling myself up from my own bootstraps and kind of reaching to the stars, so
Right.
to speak, the kind of the American optimism, whatever you may call it, right? And as a result of that, even a political movement always you always start with the self instead of looking at, as you say, the kind of social person or the social nature of a human being. And I think that's probably the best critique. And what I found interesting is what you propose as an alternative to utilitarianism, this kind of your left utilitarianism framework or theory or whatever you may call it, the
Mhm.
same could be applied. That framework could be applied even to effective altruism.
Right. Great. Yeah. Great. So yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on, and you can see why people in elite positions, people who've been very successful, people who've got PhDs or made millions of dollars in tech, would be attracted to an ideology that says, people's success is of their own making, because it makes them seem good, right?
Yeah,
It makes it it
yeah.
makes it makes it seem like they're special.
Sort of like
Um,
I earned this success.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas, yeah, deep. I think this is a very deep part of my philosophical thinking, in that I just I don't see, very deep to mean that I'm saying it's something especially profound. I mean, it's something that I'm sort of fundamentally committed to, is the idea that a huge amount of the important things are not produced by individuals, but they're produced by society. And, you know, look, I'm in quite a privileged social position. I've had, a reasonable amount of success in my career. Do I put that down to myself? Like my own sort of genetic endowment, or my own hard work, or my own skills? Not really. Like, I put it down to, society was structured in a way that sort of helped people like me, and I got lucky at various points. And what does that mean? It means that the fortune that I've had is just that, fortune. And
well
so,
put. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I owe something back to society, sort of as a result.
yeah.
And I think if you have this more sort of, yeah, individualistic outlook, you're going to be less amenable to the idea that, yeah, a socialist would 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 want that, like, many more decisions about how resources in society are used are made collectively, rather than by particular individuals who own them and maybe think they earn them.
Yeah, I joke around sometimes, the Americanism, fortune favors the brave. I just say, nah, fortune favors the fortunate. It's just if
Right.
you're fortunate, you're fortunate. That's got very little to do with you being brave or not. Not perfect, perfect, Nikhil. I think kind of your ethos that, as you pointed out, that's kind of the deep philosophical question you're pursuing and exploring as a political philosopher. And I think there's a lot we could the I think we could re-theorize or kind of explore already existing theories through that lens of the social nature of a person, as we've discussed extensively in this conversation. All right, Nikhil, we're a bit over time, so is it okay? One last question, if I could ask you this. I really want to ask you this
Sure.
because I think it pertains to EA. I don't know if you saw the article that I linked in some of the questions I sent you. This was in The Guardian. The article's titled, I'll leave a link to this in the description down below and in the show notes. America's premier pro-natalists on having tons of kids to save the world. There are going to be countries of old people starving to death, and the idea is what you would call long-termism, which we see coming kind of from the EA circle. And then one critique I've heard of this kind of long-termist view is that it seems that this worldview tends to care only about the outcome, but not particularly the experience of people. So I'll ask this question in a bipartite manner, perhaps. Firstly, what are your views on this EA-inspired or EA-adjacent philosophy, which is long-termism? And then how do you respond to this, which in my view, I think quite accurate critique of the fact that it seems it's a very outcome focused philosophy and not focused on the everyday immediate experience of people. And this Guardian article, it's perhaps a good one because, and now I'm going to get a bit scandalous here. If you think of a figure like Elon Musk, he's got what, 10, 11 kids. So he's trying to have, he's the poster boy for the pronatalists. However, I don't think he has a good relationship with most of his children. So how do you kind of reconcile those two contradictions in this kind of thinking? But yeah, if you could please comment on that, Nikhil.
Yeah, great. So, the first thing I want to say is like, so we're now talking about an area of philosophy called population ethics. And population ethics has this interesting feature whereby any claim that you make about it can be twisted into something that sounds crazy and or evil, right? So, um, but but still, we need to make claims about it because these issues are important, right? The issue of how we should think about the welfare of future people, the issue of how we should think about population expansion and population decline. These are like important issues that will have a lot of ramifications on society and are like also vital for thinking about how we live as individuals as well. So we need to say things about them. But yeah, if you say like those people in the Guardian article, oh, having kids is great, you should just have loads of kids, loads of people read that article and found those people like, seem to be quite weird. But also if there's, on the other side, there's people who say, actually, it wouldn't be a problem if humanity went extinct. We shouldn't have kids, for the good of the planet or the good of the people who already exist. Those people sound pretty weird as well, right? So it's very difficult to find a position here that doesn't make you sound weird. Okay,
That's for
so
sure.
with that sort of disclaimer, um, I think I'll answer this in two parts. So first, what I think philosophically about population ethics, and then secondly, a little bit about the politics of this question. So yeah, you mentioned long-termism, and this is something that's come out of the effective altruist movement. Um, and it connects as well to the utilitarian philosophy we talked about at the start. So long-termists believe that one of the most important things that we can do is to think about the welfare and act in the interest of the welfare of people a long time in the future, right? People who don't yet exist and might never exist and will only come to exist sort of thousands of years down the line. Now, why should you think this? So go back to the definition of utilitarianism. The right thing to do is the thing that will maximize overall well-being. Well, that implies that it's better to, improve the well-being of a large number of people than it is to improve the well-being of a small number of people, if the improvements are the same amount, right? So it's just a way of saying utilitarianism is sensitive to scale. And I think it's correct to be sensitive to scale. Like I do think that's true. I think it's better to help a large group of people than a small group of people. There are some philosophers who disagree, but I think that's like a highly plausible position. Now, what long-termists add to this is they say, well, look, there's about 8 billion people alive today, but the human race could go on existing for millions more years. Yeah. And over those millions of years, there's going to be loads more people come to exist. Billions, billions, and billions, maybe trillions, quadrillions, right? And so if we have a choice between helping the people that exist today and helping the people that exist in this huge long future, we should choose the latter, because the latter is more people. And so there's more possibility to create more welfare by thinking about the far future than there is by thinking about the present. And this is the sort of argument that Will MacAskill, philosopher from Oxford, makes in his book, What We Owe the Future. Okay, now, I just reviewed a book by another philosopher called Elizabeth Finneran-Burns, which she calls What We Owe to Future People. And this really gets to sort of the philosophical heart of your question, right? This idea that, MacAskill's view sort of focuses on an outcome future, right? A large amount of welfare. So he thinks, it's important to think about the future because there could be loads of welfare there. And as utilitarians, we want the most welfare possible. Whereas Finneran-Burns says, well, aren't you forgetting about the individuals involved, the people? So MacAskill says, what do we owe the future? Finneran-Burns says, what do we owe to future people? Right? Let's focus on people. And this sort of the implied critique is that the long-termists are not really interested in people. They're just interested in, this weird thing, weird abstraction of outcomes, which they call welfare. Right? Now, that's a criticism that's been around for a bit. Now, the problem that philosophers have found is it's quite difficult to come up with a view that focuses on people rather than welfare primarily, and doesn't leave us with some other highly counterintuitive results. If people are interested, it's kind of hard to explain, but if people are sort of interested in this, they can look at Derek Parfit's work in Reasons and Persons, and in particular the non-identity problem. And I talk about this in my review of the Elizabeth Finneran-Burns book, which came out recently in Times Literary Supplement. So these sort of people-focused views have a particular kind of problem, but it does seem weird, right? For long-termists, that they care about the amount of welfare that's in the future, but they can't really attach that welfare to people because the people in the future don't yet exist, right?
Right.
So
it's like
what's
an
going on?
abstract person.
Shouldn't Right, exactly. Shouldn't our philosophy care about people rather than welfare? And the sort of view that I like here is something that's been defended by philosophers like Richard Yetta Chapel and Elizabeth Ashford, um, which is, yeah, we should want to maximize the amount of welfare. Um, but the reason we want to maximize the amount of welfare isn't because, like, the amount of welfare is a good thing, right? It's because what this abstraction, the amount of welfare, is an abstraction of, is what's going on in people's lives, right? So, what I mean by the amount of welfare is like how much stuff is there in people's lives that makes their lives go better. We talked about this earlier, like freedom, leisure time, good relationships, meaningful work, material well-being, right? These are all the things that go into making someone's life better. And what welfare is just like a summary of that. So there's this idea that utilitarians sort of fetishize welfare in this way that is brought out in the long-termist debate. But I think you got to keep in mind that all that we mean by welfare is the things that make people's lives go better, right? And so how does this help sort of shed light on the long-termism stuff? I do think we should care about future generations and we should care about their welfare. But not because and we should want to maximize welfare, but not because maximizing welfare is a good thing in itself, but because, it's better that future people have good lives than that future people have worse lives, right? It's better that they have lives with more good things. And now, does that put me in exactly the same camp as McCaskill and the long-termists? Well, not necessarily, right? Because although I do care about the amount of welfare there is in the future, because I care about future people, I think some of the calculations long-termists rely on to get this result, that it's really important to think about future people, are a little bit suspect, right? So there's huge uncertainties about what the future will be like. There's huge uncertainties about what the size of the future population will be. And they make a lot of assumptions that are a little bit suspect in order to get these long-termist numbers off the ground. And so, and I think the biggest problem with long-termism is probably that it's just very hard to find things that we should be doing now that clearly will have this like massive impact on the quadrillions of future people, right? So I'm a little cool on long-termism, although I do want to resist this objection to utilitarianism that like, oh, you only care about welfare, you don't care about the people. The welfare matters because the people matter, right? That on that, I want to defend the utilitarians. Okay, so that's the sort of philosophical view. I do want to talk a little bit about the politics of this kind of like pro-natalist
Yeah, because I
agenda,
think,
right?
because yeah, exactly, because I think Nikhil, the article, in fact, that I brought up, which also was this article was kind of discussed amongst, I saw like the Twitter space and people who are interested in these
Yeah,
kind of questions,
yeah,
and even on like YouTube and whatnot. It was more the politics of the article that was the political implications that were people were kind of being sardonic about or being a bit critical of. So yes, please, if you could
yeah,
just expand on that, the politics of
yeah.
the matter.
Great. So, as I said, anything you say about population ethics makes you sound weird and or evil. Um,
Correct.
and but I I think it's important that we don't allow that to stop us saying things about it, right? I think it is a genuinely important social phenomenon and social issue that birth rates everywhere in the world are falling, and that's going to have social and economic consequences, perhaps some good, perhaps some bad. It's worth thinking about. The number of people that are in your society and the age profile of your society is going to have like big effects on how your society works. And I don't think we can just run away from that because it seems kind of like weird to discuss this stuff, right? On the other hand, I am very worried about this sort of pro-natalist agenda being used by people who don't actually care about the well-being of society and the welfare of future people at all, right? The pro-natalist agenda is apt, I think, to be used and exploited by people who actually care about things like the preservation of particular racial groups, who care about the domination of women and traditional family roles.
Indeed. There's even a bit
and
of
I
a
think,
social Darwinist strain to it too.
yeah. So you get these people who. So I am concerned about changes in birth rates because it's going to have various economic and social changes. It's going to have various economic and social effects, some of which may be harmful. We might have to, think about how we design public policy around this. I'm also concerned about birth rates because, a lot of people want to have kids and feel that they can't for whatever reason. Partly this has to do with our societies not giving very much support to young parents. I think this is a big problem with capitalism at the moment. I'm also concerned about birth rates because I do think it's a good thing if there are more happy children in the world, right? But these things need to be discussed very carefully because other people are concerned about birth rates for much more worrying reasons, right? People are concerned about birth rates because they believe it's important to preserve the white race, say. Or people are concerned about birth rates because they're worried that women are sort of forgetting that their place ought to be in the home. Or they're worried about birth rates because they think, different demographic groups, be that racial groups or class groups with higher birth rates, are going to take over, something like that. These ideas need to be really strongly opposed and excluded, especially from effective altruist spaces. And I don't think the effective altruist movement has actually done a very good job at making sure that these sorts of views are properly excluded from their spaces. And why should these views be excluded? It's not just because it's not my politics, right? It's not just because I want to exclude right-wing people. It's because although a lot of these people claim to be interested in facts and logic and science, the views that they're talking about are just totally describe interest. These people who are interested in the purported science of racial differences and IQ, right? There's a whole research program that's just been utterly discredited by modern science. right? People who believe that immigration is a huge problem. And you see this in like, sort of Elon Musk's rightward turn. Again, like anyone who actually follows social science, economic theory, and cares about human welfare should think that probably a bit more immigration would be good for the world. A bit more democracy would be good for the world. Decolonization was good for the world. Right? And women having more freedom and equality is good for the world, right? These things are like pretty well confirmed by and anyone who truly cares about well-being and truly cares about the facts of the situation needs to really distance themselves from these people, and that's sort of what I'm worried about with this pronatalist stuff in EA. And I think it's just like really important to separate these things out.
Perfect. And I think probably the message here would be get off Twitter and read some actual social science and political philosophy and not
Right.
not fall into the pseudo thinking that you see on social media, specifically Twitter. That was perfect. Thank you, Nikhil. I think
Absolutely.
you covered it extensively. Beautifully put. I'm sure this episode too will have a bit of controversy because there are certain topics, Marxism, utilitarianism, psychoanalysis. Whenever I have a guest on that discusses these topics, the comment section both on YouTube and Spotify get very heated. So I'm sure it'll be interesting.
All
But
right.
I've got to ask. In fact, let me turn on my video just so that we could see each other. I've got to ask, what other projects are you working on right now? Is it? I'm sure it's something to do with utilitarianism, but what are the upcoming projects you're working on?
Yeah, so um I want to get more. Yeah, so a lot of it's about working out in greater detail and rigor a lot of the things we've been discussing here. I briefly mentioned this worry about like the uncertainties involved in long-term miscalculations, so I'm writing something about that. Um, I'm thinking about and also about how this like solution to collective actions I talked about, right? Thinking about the we, what can we do rather than what can I do? So like, yeah, fleshing out in more detail how that works. Um, yeah, and another thing I've become interested in recently is that artificial intelligence, obviously, like huge topic at the moment, and seeing what I can contribute there with a distinctively sort of Marxist slash utilitarian take. So yeah, watch out for that.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly something that I'm interested in. So, in fact, I'll be talking to a few Marxist philosophers early next year who are kind of theorizing on artificial intelligence through a Marxian lens.
Oh, yeah, great, great.
And
I'd be really interested in that.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be a fantastic conversation. But no, thank you for your time, Nikhil. And also, I'll leave a link to your website and then your dissertation, all of that, and in the show notes. But once
Yeah.
again, this was very, very, I think, extensive. We covered a lot of topics, and indeed, we can keep going deeper. But I think it's a good start. So, thank you.